Today I want to talk about pests and pathogens like I did before, mostly with biocontrols and other sorts of things, but I've been inspired to talk about, let's see, there's the reason right there that I don't want to have sound on, because then if I get a message from people, it's just going to continue to be a problem. Anyways, hopefully you can bear with that. I don't know how other people do it. If you do a lot of live, or you see people on live a lot and you have advice, I'm open to that input. Anyways, pests and pathogens, how they come about, why, what techniques, what makes a pest really successful, and what makes a pest really good at what it does at infecting your plants. I think that's a really important subject that a lot of people don't think about, but it's incredibly important, and the reasons are often physiological and not a lot of people. A lot of people are encountering powdery mildew. Not a lot of people know about its physiology or its bionomics, or why it's able to infect in the first place, what's the process, and all that sort of thing. If you understand that, even to a very basic level, you can begin to appreciate a pest or a pathogen's capabilities and what allows it to ingress into your crop. And then you can use that knowledge to better protect yourself from the pest. So that makes sense, right? So I wanted to talk about one of the more common pests that people get in general. So that's going to be the two-spotted spider mite, Tetronychus urticae. Very common. Like I've said before, 1,200 plus host plant recognition documented. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only amount. It's probably more than 1,200 if we consider all plants, but nobody's considered all plants because that's not possible for an individual study. And maybe a meta-analysis or 3 or 10 would be able to show that over time. Anyways, so spider mites. In another one of my videos, I went over the fact that Tetronychus urticae is a very impressive organism from a genetic level, from an adaptation level. I think a lot of growers should appreciate how adaptive the spider mite genome is. So for example, there's two big main points that are kind of cool that I want to share with you. The first one is that Tetronychus urticae has homologous genes from fungi and bacteria. And what that means is that those genes have transferred horizontally to the organism. So typically genes are vertically transmitted from parent to offspring. That's called vertical transmission. And people who maybe follow me or have seen my comments, I'll make a point that like a virus or a pathogen can or can't be vertically transmitted. That's what that means. Vertical transmission is from parent to progeny. And that's important because a pathogen or a pest which overwinters maybe in the debris of the other plant from last season, then this season the seeds go into the soil, the plant sprouts, and oh hey, so does the pest. It comes out right at the same time, and it's already got a food source. That's not quite the same thing as vertical transmission, but the same kind of concept that will make a pest successful is if it overwinters right next to its host, right? Because it doesn't have to move very far. But for pathogens, that's incredibly important. A virus that can infect a plant or an animal or whatever, and then be transferred to its offspring, guarantees it a host. That's like the golden crown of pathogen, like what a pathogen would most desire if it could do such a thing. It would want to be able to go from host to host with no trouble at all. And over time, sometimes pathogens and microbes become symbionts, and symbiosis happens from that. Like a beneficial organism, over time can become like the mitochondria. There's a very, very substantiated theory that because mitochondria have different DNA than we do, that mitochondrial DNA, so mitochondria were cells, other cells that became part of the ancestral organisms from. I'm speaking very simply, but it's kind of insane to think about that we have an organism or an organelle of our cells that is so ancestral it used to be another organism, essentially. And that's what happens for Tetranychus urticae. It has genes that, through association with a fungus or a bacteria or some sort of infection event or multiple infection events over time, became a part of its genome, those genes. And those genes allow it to like synthesize carotenoids and get rid of or process certain compounds that might normally be poisonous to it. So the genes either had no effect or increased its fitness, and probably increased its fitness considering its ancestral level, and the fact that it's still being conserved in the Tetranychus urticae genome. Anyways, that's a little bit, hopefully that's not a little bit like too off the walls for people, but my point is that you can expect spider mites to be able to be on a bunch of different hosts, and that's number one, a pest that can be, how do I put it? A pest that is able to infect or infest multiple hosts probably is able to adapt to a lot of hosts in general. So a super generalist, a lot of aphids, a lot of spider mites are this way. They're able to infest multiple hosts, many hosts. And then that thrips, some thrips are generalists too. So that allows them to infest many different plants. It allows them to have a lot of different safe havens. So instead of being on your crop, it might be on the plant right next to it that you planted because it's pretty, or because it's for food, or it's just part of the natural landscape and there's no way to cut down all the trees or clear all of the plants. That kind of a thing. That makes a pest really successful. For the same reason why having a lot of skills can make you very successful and allow you to hop from one job to another job or something like that. It's the same kind of concept. The second thing that makes a pest really, really successful is tolerance to different environments, which is kind of the same thing. And I won't go into this too much because it sort of butts up against the third thing I would talk about, which is that a pest that is really successful is one that can reproduce very quickly and reproduce to a great number. That's a really big, in my opinion, that's a really big sign of a pest that is successful. A pest that is able to maybe reproduce just once, or doesn't even need sexual reproduction to make more of itself. So, for example, aphids are born pregnant a lot of the time, not all of the time, not all aphid species. It's hard to paint with a broad stroke because there's always going to be that one exception species, or there's going to be some really small detail to consider. But a lot of aphids are born pregnant. A lot of pests in general are parthenogenic, which means that they don't require a male to fertilize them. Some organisms are able to, so like for example, I mentioned russet mites. A female russet mite doesn't need a male to make other males, but it does need a male to make other females. So what happens is that like for example, one female russet mite can be on a plant, subsist, if it's a host plant, and then it produces a bunch of males, and then it reproduces with those males, its sons, and then fertilized eggs become females, and then the cycle continues. So in those cases, you just need one of those pests, just one, and you have a population that can affect your crops. So that makes you super successful. And if you're in a greenhouse, or if you're in an environment that's like warm and in your environmental tolerance, like 9 out of 12 months or something, then you're doing really good, especially if your natural environment, you were only active for like 4 out of 12 months, like a single season or something. Or if you don't have any natural predators, which is the fourth characteristic. If you don't have any natural predators, you reproduce really quickly and quite gregariously. You have an extreme environmental range, and you're incredibly adaptive. Those 4 qualities make you a super pest. And a lot of pests are pests because of that reason. So I bring this up because if you think that I've encountered this sentiment a lot in agriculture in general, where people think that they are bad growers because they got pests. And I think that anyone who thinks that of other people is wrong, definitely wrong. And people who say that to other people are really damaging and gaslighting others. People get pests all the time. People get pests. That's what I'm talking about. So, if anyone has input for me being able to get rid of that sort of input, that sound, I'm all for it, because I don't want to I'm constantly getting messages from people, for example, who have questions and comments to make, which I appreciate. I don't really want, I don't want that to distract from what I was saying, especially when I put this on YouTube, which I'm going to do. So everyone who's posting here should know these videos are going up on YouTube, on my channel, Zenthanol. So anyways, how do I put this? So people get pests, people get pathogens. Prevention works. Prevention's the best way to go about things. But prevention works all the way up until it doesn't. And then you have to treat. So prevention works well, and people who don't focus on prevention are honestly, usually they're firefighting every single day. They have a problem here, and then they have a problem there, and they're always reacting to problems. And that's not good for business, any sort of business, and that's not good for agriculture, because if you don't have a plan, you can't affect change. And you're always going to be at the mercy, or at least you're going to be more at the mercy of Mother Nature, essentially, whatever's going to happen to you, than you would be regardless. That makes sense, right? So, so people get pests, is my main point. And pests are, there's also the idea that a plant that is, sufficiently healthy is able to, not get pests. Sure, sort of, if it's resistant or tolerant to certain organisms. But that happens all the time without people realizing it. When people say that a plant is not suitable as a host for certain pests, that is resistance. That's level 0 resistance, basically, but that's resistance. It is a type of resistance. That pest cannot eat that plant for a number of reasons, right? That could be because the plant has phytochemicals that are poisonous, and the pest can't adapt to it. It could be a physical barrier, such that if you were to mash up the the leaves or the tissue or something, maybe the organism could feed on it. But if it can't penetrate, then there's a big problem. There's some fungi that are they're vectored by beetles, because the beetles will tear into the tree, for example, and it will scrape away the bark, or it will dig through the bark, and then it will feed. But the fungus is on the beetle. It's on the spores are on it, or something like that. And then as soon as it makes contact with the phloem, or the sap, then that fungus, or that whatever pathogen we're talking about, gets into the plant, and then it can infect the plant that way. So the plant's natural immune system, part of which is being the physical barrier of, the same reason why we have skin, right? Same kind of thing, is great, right up until a pest comes in that is able to do this for the fungus, and so you have an infection. So I think it's really important to not think like plant health is incredibly important, and putting that into a context is incredibly important. And what you consider to be healthy or not is incredibly important to quantify. If you don't do that, you just say that, oh, our plants look healthy. Well, what does that mean? Good, like I've said, good is not a number. You have to know what you're talking about. Especially on a commercial scale, these people are dealing with, with like corn and soybean and other bigger crops. Like, you're dealing with millions upon millions of dollars with the crop alone, not counting the market, the fact that people are counting on you to make food or whatever product, whatever agricultural product you're making, right? So, and pests are going to take advantage of that. And since ecology is always changing and is rapidly changing, we're always going to have new pests, at least theoretically. It's constantly happening. There are pests that are pests of crops that we grow in the United States, for example, and they also exist elsewhere. Same crop, but the pests don't exist in the United States. So they'll exist in like Europe, or they'll exist in Vietnam, or they'll exist in China or somewhere. And the only thing keeping us from having that same crop problem here is customs. Which I don't mean I mean customs like at the airport. Groups and organizations that keep the bad tissue, the bad products out. That's what's keeping us safe. And they're doing the same thing. I mean, if they have a functioning organization that does that, which we don't always put a lot of money into over here in the U.S. So we're battling new pests as well, like the spotted lanternfly in Pennsylvania. That's not from here, and we've just started seeing it a year and a half ago. Will it become a big pest? Nobody knows yet. And if we don't really try to kill it fast, and we don't have a concerted effort, we're going to have another pest to deal with, right? So I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is that pest adaptation happens all the time. It's constantly happening. It's happening every time you spray a chemical. It's happening every time you apply a biological as well. If you're familiar with Darwin's Islands, it's the same sort of a thing. You have sort of adaptation and populations that are changing in these little islands of greenhouses and farm populations and things like that. So you should constantly be considering the fact that what you're doing might not be enough, or you need to be considering your options always and be having your ear to the ground and considering what's going what's going on around you. Haven't really been taking people's questions, but I really wanted to discuss and kind of just sort of dictate. I guess it's not really a question and answering like my last video, but I wanted to dictate to people that plant health is an important concept, but it's also not helpful to tell people that a plant is not going to get pests ever just because it's a certain level of healthy, because that's not true. Pests are effective because they're able to overmatch the immune system of their host. That's what makes them successful. That is literally the definition. If they couldn't do that, they wouldn't be effective. Now, it's certainly true that a plant that is more healthy can resist better, but if they have something that overmatches all of that immune system, what are you going to do? Nothing. There are even genes, like I've talked about before, like susceptibility genes that pathogens exploit in a plant. They're literally baked into the genome. It's not like there's some creator that created this to be that way as like an equalizer. It just is how these organisms co-evolved, right? For the same reason why a predator is really effective at, like a Persimilus is really effective at taking out spider mites. They co-evolved together for probably millions of years. And that's how that happened. Same thing with pathogens. If you accept that one is the case, you have to accept that the other is the case too. If you accept that Persimilis is a very good predator because it is co-evolved with its prey, the two-spotted spider mite, you must also acknowledge that a pathogen is going to be able to, because it's co-evolved with a particular plant or multiple plants, that is why it's also going to be effective, is that it can overmatch the defenses of its host, right? That makes sense, right? I hope so. Now I'm going to go over the comments, which I have been totally ignoring this entire time, and start answering some questions. Hopefully you guys will accept that I might not address everything, but yeah, I really appreciate everyone's good, positive responses. I think it's really important to have a dialogue too, and I really appreciate people making the points that they do and interacting and engaging. That's a really important aspect for me for social media and for sharing this information, because I don't know what people are struggling with if they don't tell me, and I don't know what to say if people don't respond. So, but most people do, and most people have an input and an opinion, and that's important to address. So I'm going to do that right now. Terpene Dream says, or asks, what microscope would you recommend for scoping? Maybe one that can scope compost tea as well. Well, you're going to need a... there's two main camps of microscopes. One of them is an observational microscope, right? And I'm totally blanking on what you would call, I guess, I don't know what you would call the other kind, but that's the kind that I have. I don't actually have an observational microscope at my house, for example, but like 6 years ago for a Christmas present, I asked for an amscope that could let me look at microbes and things like that. So I didn't get an observational microscope. Those would be effective for like microarthropods and larger organisms and like leaf structure. And you could look at like mold structures, but you couldn't necessarily look at the individual cells. But you could tell like, oh, that looks like downy mildew rather than powdery mildew. Oh, this looks like a rust, for example. But with a big high-powered microscopes, you can see like 300, 400 times. You can see like individual spores and things like that. What would I recommend for like scope? I would recommend an observational microscope for what you're talking about, but you wouldn't be able to scope out compost tea with it. Those are two different items. Hopefully you get that. Yeah, so here's another question from Dr. Splifferton. Could or have you put together an IPM system or chart for indoor cannabis with your favorite products? I don't like to endorse products, typically. It's just an impartiality thing. I like to endorse active ingredients and organisms like in bioinsecticides and things like that. But I run into a problem where people will, unfortunately, they're going to call foul, and they think that I'm going to be endorsing a product, or I never thought that I was like big enough or had a big enough audience for people to be like, you know, you're an influencer, but I guess I kind of am. For the people who are influenced by me, right? So even the people that I work with. And I don't really like to put it out publicly because some people will get offended that their product, who I might have a relationship with, like personally, or who I've worked with, they might be like, oh, why did you pick this person who's my competitor and not another person? It gets political. So I'm sorry, like I can't really do that. But if privately you want to ask me, what are some products you like? What are some products you dislike? There's no one perfect product typically, which is also a reason why I try not to like be dogmatic about these sorts of things. But yeah, ask me in the private, in DM or something. I'd be happy to go over that. Let's see. Can you be my biology professor? Absolutely. Just get on these lives and go to my YouTube channel, and I'll be happy to be your biology professor. Oh yeah, the pine beetle, Saint Bernard's observation booth. Yeah, the pine beetle, the emerald ash borer. These are good examples. I don't think they carry, I forget if they carry a fungus, but like that's exactly what I was drawing from for that analogy. About the organism that can travel into the bark and then vectors a pathogen. So it doesn't kill the tree, the pathogen on it kills the tree, which is actually not great for the beetle, because the beetle wants to have its host, but the pathogen kills it, unfortunately. Okay. Doc CBD asks, please explain to the people what days to harvest means. I have so many people who do not know this. Right. So if you have, you can spray up to a certain number of days before your harvest. I mean, like, I almost feel like it's a trick question. Am I forgetting something really fundamental? I hope not. Not on live, hopefully, where everyone on the internet will tell me if I've gotten something wrong or not. I try to be really cut and dry and precise with what I talk about. But yeah, so you've got a crop that grows for a certain amount of time, typically. And then you can spray or you can apply a pesticide or a compound or a biopesticide even up to a certain days before harvest, or maybe to harvest, right? So that usually means to a certain amount of, it's different for different crops, but a certain amount of development for a fruit, for example, or if it's in horticulture, it's like days up until like when a flower starts to grow. There's a couple of compounds or bioinsecticides I've used in the past where, or I've seen used in the past where the product will note that for like ornamentals where you're supposed to look pretty, like a flower, you shouldn't spray it when you're flowering or when there's a lot of flowering, so you should spray it right after your cut flower harvest or whatever. Because it's going to like cause like a haze, or it might like make things look a little waxy or something weird like that. So consumers don't want that, and producers obviously want their products to look good. So that's the reason for that. Or if it's a systemic pesticide or something like that, it'll be in the fruit if you spray it during that time. So obviously that's a no-no. Let's see here. Okay. I'm going to say Shugs Midwest Autos. I'm going to pronounce it that way, unless it's Suggs. What about using silica to help build cell walls to help with pest resistance? That's a good question. So, how do I put this? Some plants, to certain degrees, have the ability to bioaccumulate silica. And there's some debate as to, like, whether or not you would consider that a micronutrient or not, or whether that's just the plant what's called sequestering this element or this compound, if it's like a silica compound or something like that. So sequestration is just when an organism takes up something. I just talked about the spider mite, right? So they have a ton of genes that are particularly, they're just, all they do is they help sequester or process certain compounds. So a plant being how it is, which is a great way to explain it, they're like a systemic pesticide that doesn't exist out in nature, but the way that the compound is allows it to be taken up by the plant. It's not a conscious decision by the plant. And it might not even be used for physiological processes, right? But it may just get sequestered into the cells, and that's an adaptation, right? Because silica can be in the soil, and certain plants that ancestrally grew in soils like that might have a predisposition for that. And a lot of plants do, and a lot of plants don't, and I think it's also sort of contentious as to which ones are more or less like that. But absolutely, it's kind of like... it's like building your castle walls with a little bit stronger of a material. So that is a real thing, but I don't think that it's enough to really, in my experience, which is not, limitless, I don't feel like it does a whole lot of good. In general. I mean, in general it does, but like, I don't see it like make or break an infection. Usually the best you can hope for is that it makes growth harder, for like powdery mildew, for example, it doesn't necessarily make it totally resistant, if that answers your question. Oh yeah, Phil Callahan and Tom Dykstra, regarding how insects can smell sick plants with their antennae. I think Phil Callahan, if I'm right, he's the same guy who said something. He established the electromagnetic sensitivity for ants or whatever. If we're talking about the same Callahan. Now, I would love input on this because I've gone to try to like, because that sounds sort of like woo to me. It has in the past. I wouldn't be surprised, and I think I've seen research reports, and I think I've even talked about research reports regarding, well, for example, honeybees and bumblebees, I think as well, they are very sensitive to the electromagnetic spectrum, and like power lines and things like that. That level of like intensity can have adverse effects on their ability to exist. Okay, so it looks like I guess I went offline for a bit. Sorry, you guys. But yeah, anyways, I don't have a lot of information on Callahan and Dykstra, to be honest. And I haven't been able to come across a lot of their research reports, and I haven't seen a lot of citations from other people. And that's a big red flag to me. Some people like to say that there's a conspiracy and that sort of a thing, but that doesn't hold water with me. If it was really truly revolutionary and it was really truly like repeatable and replicatable, then I would expect to see that somewhere. And I don't. But that could just be me not looking hard enough, I'll be honest. So I don't have a lot on that. Let's see, let me go back down to the top here, or for the bottom here, I should say. Okay, here's this question from Zachary with an X, Thompson. How are there not more people in here? Okay, yeah, that's a good question. But I mean, like, maybe I'm boring. I should work on that. Yeah, Doc CBD, magnetic I wouldn't say ley lines unless you mean something else, because when I think of ley lines, I think of, like, ley with an E, ley lines from like D&D and stuff. So I don't know if we call them ley lines. Are you just gonna say the same question over and over again until I address it? Up in Smoke 69. But let me address it since we're here. Pyganic, Grandivo, Met 52, Azamax. They should get rid of root aphids, right? Maybe. That's a really context-dependent question. Are they rated for root aphids? Are all of those products rated for root aphids? Are any of them rated for root aphids? Rice root aphids? I don't think so. I think Azamax might be. But also, again, like, your formulations might be different. These are all brand names of products, right? So, usually the formulations are consistent, but not always. Yeah, so like Pyganic doesn't have a drench rate, somebody is pointing out. So like, yeah, I mean, like, maybe there's no reason they wouldn't work, right? Like pyrethrins, I've seen pyrethrins work on many aphid species, and I've seen it work on root aphids, on rice root aphids. So like, yes, I guess so, but they're not labeled for it necessarily, and that's kind of where you run into a problem if you're a commercial grower. If you're just growing by yourself, that's a little bit different, but it's kind of hard to speak, and there's a lot of legal restrictions about what's okay and what's not okay to say. That's another reason why I try to be really precise with my answer, because it's really important to be that way, especially when you're recommending something to use. Plus, I don't really want to give somebody a false sense of what's all right and what's not all right, and I'm not afraid of saying I don't know something, potentially. 420 to 710 asks, is it possible that BT and Lab, I guess you mean lactobacillus, compete or complement each other? Sure, but there's a bunch of different isolates, and it's really hard to talk about it in broad strokes, which is an unsatisfying answer, but complex answers rarely are super satisfying, unless you're into that stuff. Yeah, That's the phrase. Thanks. All right. So with regards to Callahan, paramagnetism is the kind of the key word you want to look for. And yeah, it's kind of like I don't see anyone else talking about it, but other Hymenoptera, which ants are Hymenoptera, do have a sensitivity to. And like I was just posting about how Drosophila flies have they have neurons that help them orient to the sun, which isn't magnetism, but like organisms have really esoteric and interesting ways of interacting with the world that is not necessarily visible and easy to discern visibly. So I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if there was some sort of like electromagnetic sensitivity that allowed them to like detect certain things. But I think a lot of people take it to an extreme that turns it into pseudoscience, which is my honest opinion. But I'm open to like other input. I just haven't seen that yet myself. Zachary is saying that Azimax got rid of his root aphids with a 1 milliliter per gallon drench. Good for you. I mean, and I don't mean that flippantly. I mean, like, that's a good thing to hear. Right, so I'm really going to have to stop saying people's names after the the Godfucker. Would nematodes help with root parasites? Well, it depends on the parasites. Some nematodes are root parasites. Some of them are incredibly difficult and some of the worst root parasites ever. And we're talking about non-predatory nematodes, obviously. But some pests, some root pests can be killed with certain certain nematodes. Definitely. Absolutely. And then I'm not justifying that statement at all. So I just want to give an example. The problem with nematodes typically, depending on the species, because there's a lot of differences. So nematodes don't kill their prey directly. Nematodes kill their prey through having a symbiotic bacteria or multiple symbiotic bacteria in their bodies that they release. Those kill the prey. And then the nematode will reproduce in the host that's dying and feed on it and that kind of stuff. So the problem you come to is if you don't have enough prey or your prey isn't big enough, and I mean that, like a root aphid is really small. If you compare what a nematode, even though nematodes are microscopic, if you compare like the size of a root aphid and the host and what it can be for a host, and you compare that to fungus gnats and like fungus gnat larvae, which are bigger, or you compare that to like a beetle grub, which is like this big around or this big around or something like that, way different, and you can make way more nematodes. But if your nematodes don't have a good host, they might kill their host but not reproduce very well. And even if they do reproduce, you might not make enough to like kind of sustain the population. So they can help, but you might have to keep on reintroducing, especially depending on the substrate that you're using. Soil versus soilless substrate also plays a role. There's a lot of things to consider with regards to nematodes and other things. Tom Dykstra claims that a Brix level of above 14 will keep most bugs except grasshoppers off of plants. Any thoughts? Yeah, I guess I'm surprised that grasshoppers are the exception. That's one thought. The other thought is, like, does this include pathogens and what plants? Because is that true of all plants? Is that only true for a certain selection of plants? Plant physiology is very complex and very different. And even different cultivars can be incredibly different. I'm surprised. I'm not sure I could agree with it as a broad stroke truth. And I'd be curious to know why that is, because I honestly don't know. I don't know why the Brix being above 14 would kick most bugs out. I do know that there is such thing as the what do they call it? Trophobiosis. Trophobiosis is kind of related to what we're talking about here. I know that aphids, for example, if the plant is highly nitrogenous, has a lot of nitrogen in it, you might have heard that certain pests will be able to feed on it and reproduce more rapidly. And some aphids are an example of this, where a plant that is like supercharged with nitrogen might grow really well, but the aphids will also feed on it, and they will be, because it's the nitrogen in the phloem that they're tapping, that they like. So that basically supercharges your pest aphid. Now, that's not true for all organisms. They have different nutrient requirements, but like probably true for other Stereonica, like whiteflies and leaf hoppers and plant hoppers and phloem feeders that have like stylets. I don't know if that's true of like spider mites, for example, but like having a high nitrogen content can have that effect, for example, and that's called trophobiosis, I believe. Hopefully I'm not screwing that up. What would you, Up in Smoke says, what would you recommend for root aphids? What products specifically? Again, I don't really endorse product names, but I would say that it depends on how bad the infestation is, honestly. Because some products, like pyrethrins, for example, work pretty well. But I've seen them burn plants, depending on your plant, depending on how you apply it. As a drench, for example. I know that I wouldn't really recommend a lot of predatory organisms because they're not necessarily going to go into the soil. So you run into that problem. Nematodes are different, for example. Beauveria bassiana, the entomopathogenic fungus, is going to be able to be drenched into the soil or the substrate, right? But like lacewing larvae, rove beetle, those sorts of organisms, they can fight aphids on the phyllosphere, but they're not going to dig into the rhizosphere. So they're never going to kill the organism like that's in the roots, that is existing in the roots and isn't anywhere else, and is not moving out of the roots, right? Does that make sense? Let's see, keeping this moving. So Samsara Gardens asks, what are some good procedures to keep Swirskyii and Phalasis alive and reproducing in your outdoor garden? Pollen's a good thing. I mentioned that in the last live. Pollinivorous organisms are ones that can eat pollen, and if you can establish a banker crop, essentially, so if you have ornamental peppers, if you have castor beans are a good example. I've mentioned those two a bunch of times. People are probably tired of me hearing me listing just two plants, right? There are other plants that could be useful, but those are the ones that people fall back on because they're really easy to get, they're very common, and they make a lot of pollen. And it's kind of like if it's not broke, don't fix it sort of a thing. But there are definitely other plants. And castor beans are invasive, right? So you should consider that when you're choosing your banker plant. That's why I like to say peppers more than castor beans, because they can also host prey. Well, they can host pests for like other kinds of organisms, or for other kinds of crops, including like cannabis, for example. So it might not be the best move, but if you already have predators of them, then it is a good move, because any spider mites that move onto your castor beans are going to be eaten by those mites that also eat spider mites, or will only eat some, or something like that. Captain Pax says, I've read that some predatory mites feed on plant sap if there is no prey left for them. Yeah, so it's true. Facultatively, which is just a fancy word of saying sometimes, in certain circumstances, certain predatory mites have been observed to eat nectar, pollen, like I just mentioned, other plant tissues, but in a very, very small amount. I know that, like, Obviously, somebody who is selling predatory mites isn't going to be like, oh, a ton of time, but like you can't see the damage. I've never seen damage really attributed to predatory mites. They don't. I think it's something probably ancestral. What I mean by that is it is probably something that they can do, that they are more commonly going to do if they're starved. Which is sort of, you might... Sorry, it looks like I paused out again. So, sorry about that. But yeah, hopefully I got that answer out. But in case I didn't, yes, that's true. Certain predatory mites do feed on plant tissue, but to a very small degree, and one that I wouldn't be worried about. And I've never seen it personally. Mold mites can as well, but to a very small degree. And they're used as feeder mites, sometimes in sachets. So just wanted to mention that. Orius also feeds on plant tissue to a very minimal amount as well. And so those aren't predatory mites. And they also feed on pollen. So that's another example. Blue of Green Tank says, I've heard that chewing insects don't recognize the plant as food at a high Brix level. Interesting. Like they don't detect it? Or I'd be really curious what that means exactly. Doesn't recognize. Because a lot of organisms that eat plants will, they might not know that their plant is a host. They'll just see the green, or they might see some sort of band of the color spectrum that we don't, right? Like if you don't know, like honeybees can see the infrared, I think they see a little bit into infrared, and they see a lot into ultraviolet. So they can see things like flower guides and things like that we cannot see. And it's like that. And they might have to like take a little test chew or like poke their stylet in. Oh, this is a good plant, or it's not, and they might not know until they try. So that's a good point. But I'm curious if that's the same thing here. Let's see. Been ignoring you all, but every time I ask a question, 3 more come up, so... Let me see how much there really is. Oh, okay. I appreciate that you guys are responding to each other as well, and kind of giving some more additional information, which I'll check out. Some of you guys are saying that there's some references for the Callahan stuff and that kind of thing, and I really appreciate that. I'll look into it, because I haven't really done a whole lot of that myself. Masonic says, I heard if you smear crap on the plant, it's good. I check your sources, personally. Captain Pax says, good to know. I found the articles, I read over it, and have wondered since. Great info. Happy to help. Powdery mildew is actually rippers. I've also heard that before, but I think there needs to be a little bit more research into that. Asking about whether pollen source would be commercially available, would be pollen work. Maybe. It depends on the pollen. I did recently do a video on YouTube that looked into this exact issue. And they talked about different pollen for different mites. And what they found was that pollen from, like, I want to say it was a Sylvester pine or something. It was poisonous to Orius, or Aureus, if you want to say it that way. So like Samsara Gardens is asking, and Blue of Green Tank is asking, pollen does matter. Most pollen should be fine. Cattail pollen is sold like as Nutrimite, I think, as a product for like BioBest. So, Blue of Green Tank also asks, what predatory mites or beneficials might eat each other? Good question. So that's called intra-guild predation. That's when an organism feeds, so an organism that's usually omnivorous but not always, feeds on another... That's not true. It's not usually omnivorous. But in this case, a lot of predatory mites are omnivorous, so that's why I say that. They will feed on another predator that feeds on its prey. So think of it as like a way to outcompete your competitors. If you feed on the young of an organism that eats the same food as you, you can destroy their population that way. And that's what you're doing. So some predator mites will intraguild-like predate on others. But it's not usually a ton, and it's usually bigger mites like adults feeding on nymphs and, sometimes they're referred to as larvae. I'm actually not sure with mites which one's the more appropriate term semantically. But, yeah, there is some of that, but not a whole lot. And I wouldn't worry about it too much, to be honest. So, there you go. Yeah, Cloudy Brains mentions that pyrethrin will also kill some beneficials. Absolutely, you got like it's an insecticide. So the same pathways that affect certain mites and certain insects that are beneficial, it's going to kill them too. The same ones that are the same products that will also kill others. Let's see. Any other questions? I thought Persimolis, so Green Tank again, may have eaten my Californicus after the 2-spud were eaten. I don't think so. Maybe. I'll have to check my notes. I have some research reports on the subject of intraguild predation. I'd be happy to share with you if you're interested. If any of you are interested in research reports, send me a message. Find this video on my YouTube channel and comment below, hey, you talked about X, do you have a reference for that? I like to make sure that people have that, that they know that I've got that information and that I'm not just saying whatever, because people who are smarter and more educated than I am have done research. And it's important for people to have access to it and not have to pay $100,000 to do so. I'm glad this is entertaining. Unless you're talking about Masonic being on here, because that's also entertaining for me too. Yeah. You certainly would think that people, humanure, right? People definitely do that. Unfortunately. Please talk about thrips. I can talk about thrips. There's over 5,000 species of thrips. But there's only like 4 or 5 that are really a big deal. Maybe maximum 10 that are like pests for one reason or another. I have a lot of videos on thrips for people who are interested in that kind of a thing. Western flower thrips are probably the most popularly talked about thrips in agriculture. I think that's probably a true statement. I'm going to say that. But depending on where you are, you might not have, or what you're growing, you might not have Western flower thrips as much as you might have chili thrips, or you might have onion thrips, which kind of like viruses, like just because they're called onion thrips doesn't mean they only go after onions. Just because they're called flower thrips doesn't mean that they only feed on like flower pollen or a lot of plants flower though, so I guess that's kind of true for them, for angiosperms. But chili thrips don't just go after chilies, that kind of a thing. I have a video on their invasion biology for people who are not aware. So those organisms will, thrips in particular, for the 4 reasons I stated previously, they reproduce a lot, they adapt to their environment really well. When they're exotic, they don't have a lot of natural predators, especially specialists, which are really good at killing them. So you have to rely on generalists to do it. And they're also really cryptic. So, like, some of them deposit eggs into the tissue, the plant tissue. So you might spray them, and they still have eggs in the tissue. And you might take a cutting, or you might give a plant to somebody else, and that's how you transfer the pest. And you can imagine that in large-scale agriculture, nobody's inspecting every single small little stem. And even if you did, even at a very boutique level of like cultivation, you're not going to get everything. So there have been cases where people like have a cutting of a citrus plant and they want to graft it onto their tree. And, they might smuggle it out of a country because they don't want to go through customs. Well, guess what? That's how you introduce a bad pest to the United States or wherever you're living. And then it's your fault that we have a big problem, and the USDA has to come in and fix your stuff because you screwed it up. But if you do it long enough and nobody knows, we don't really know who patient zero is, but now we have a big problem. Let's see here. What else? Yeah, persimmons might eat each other, definitely. That's true. That's not quite integral predation, however. Let's see. Oh, like best predators? Okay, so that's not talking about thrips. Good thing I read your comment before I went into a big diatribe about thrips. Yeah, so it depends on what you're doing and your crop and everything, but Swirsky are commonly used for thrips control in greenhouses and fields. Western flower thrips. Let's see, what else? They also go after chili thrips and onion thrips as well, so Swirsky are my favorites, predatory mites. Arias can go after nymphal thrips, and I think some adults sometimes. So those are two good predators to use against thrips. And you can establish them in your crop. So, oh yeah, I can't believe I forgot. Thanks for mentioning that, Zach the Grow Guy at BioSafe. Yeah, Cucumerus. Cucumerus and Swirsky are two really good predatory mites for that kind of a thing. What are my thoughts on Jonathan Lundgren? He's made statements like 1,500 beneficial insects for every pest. Sorry guys, I guess I got paused again. 1,500 beneficial insects for every pest. I'm not sure I agree with that necessarily. 1,500 species of good guys for every one species of bad guy. Yeah, the ecology of the world is not black and white, so no. Just on principle, I wouldn't agree with that. But the world is very complex. There might be more or less depending on the specific organism we're talking about, but for every organism that's a pest, since pest is a concept that humans make, I would agree with the idea that there might be predators for different things, but they might not be actual biocontrol agents. So here's a topic I'm going to talk about right here. Just because an organism is documented as eating a pest doesn't mean that's a biocontrol, right? So a biocontrol agent can overmatch a pest population. That's what makes it a biocontrol agent. It is for whatever reason, maybe it reproduces better, quicker, more. Maybe it eats quite a bit of